This is the first of two lessons that's going to deal with art in the Southwest, and the reason we're spending two lessons as compared to the other culture areas that we're going to be examining this semester is that there are some foundational concepts that will be established related to media that have been used, because we'll find ceramics in other parts of the country, we'll find weaving in other parts of the country, basketry in other parts of the country, and architecture in other parts of the country. Some of the ideas that we establish in this two-lesson section will come back at us again. Another reason is that if we are looking at continuous archaeological record and that's because of the arid climate of the Southwest, that there is a lot more organic material that was preserved from societies long ago, a good amount of architecture that is still preserved because it was done in stone, and there was also a decidedly important exchange of ideas that was occurring in the Southwest in various culture center areas. And with the Southwest also being a region that was in contact with, whether it be California, and would have encountered Russians at some time with tribal peoples all the way out to California, with what we now know as Mexico, would have been contact with the Spanish, as well as to the east it would have been contact with the French, the Spanish, as well as Great Britain, and then later on the United States. So it's one of these areas that had prolonged contact with non-indigenous cultures, as well as many indigenous cultures of this hemisphere. So it's one of these nexus. A nexus is a crossing place, and that's why we're spending a little bit more time in the Southwest. And the Institute of American Indian Arts is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so we pay homage to that fact also. But if we start by asking, what is the Southwest? Now, if you think back to earlier in the semester when we were talking about geopolitics, we find out that this is one of those geopolitical terms. Because when we say the Southwest, Southwest in relation to what? Aren't you always southwest of someplace else? Aren't you always southwest of someplace to the northeast? And so what is it Southwest in relation to? We realize if we look at this cartographically, cartography is the study of maps, and so if we were looking at this by the study of maps, then we would look at the Southwest as what we now know is the Four Corners area, if you've ever heard it referred to that way, and it's generally referred to as the states of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, when we show how concept changes over time, what used to be called the Northwest Territory was not the state of Washington and Oregon. It actually was Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, because it was in relation to a particular place. Northwest in relation to what? So what we see here are some of the cultures that we're going to be examining in this lesson, such as the Hohokam, the Mogollon, and the Anasazi. And then we will also move briefly, when we talk about weaving arts, into not only the Anasazi, later on known as Ancestral Pueblo. We will also start to introduce some of the arts of the Dene, as well as the Pueblo people, as we move more toward the second lesson. But if we were to look at this, then it is a superimposed, you might say, state map over a region that does not have those lines naturally. This is part of geopolitics. So, if we were to look at earlier maps, this being a map of North and South America, with Mexico included, and if you were to compare this with the maps that we see today, what you see dead center of the map would have been the Caribbean islands, such as Cuba, Santo Domingo, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, all of those islands, the Bahamas that you would see in there. You'll note that Florida looks considerably west of what we know it to be based on modern cartography, and the whole area up there was actually considered to be Florida. Yeah, right. So it wasn't just the little appendix that was sticking off the United States. That whole region was called Florida by Spain. You could probably gather this would be a Spanish map. That what you see is South America, or even what is the Yucatan Peninsula. to the southwest of Florida. That abutment there is the Yucatan Peninsula. You'll note that it looks considerably different now. And so when we're cartographically, we're still looking at a region that was west of Spain in this case, and then it was called the West Indies. Right? And that's another realization of geopolitics when we're talking about the way the world was being carved up by such countries as Spain, Portugal, England, France, Holland, and the like. A little bit better map. Now this is a little bit more accurate representation of what we would see, and you'll see an early superimposed set of lines that would relate to the states that had been settled by the time this map was drawn out. But you'll note that pretty much north of Louisiana, what is called Indian Territory, is much larger than the state of Oklahoma that we know it to be now. And this is still where now we're looking to how the Southwest would be viewed in relation to a particular place, and that would be in particular relation to a particular place of power. Now, earlier when we were talking about Spain, and I'll back that up for just a second, the region north of Mexico, and Mexico would have been the seat of power in the New World for Spain in North America. What was further north was called El Norte. El Norte meaning up north. North of what? It would have been north of Mexico City. And then once it became its own territory, it became known as Nuevo Mexico. And then it became New Mexico once it became under the hegemony of the United States. But this same territory was also called Shipapu, the center. And it was seen as the center of the world, not north or southwest of something. And in this case, when we move to this map now, we are looking at southwest in relation to the seat of power. That's the southwest in relation to Washington, D.C., or that whole continental area of the United States. So we see southwest in relation to what? We see that it's very largely geopolitical. And then when we see this map, which was the one that was drawn up to reinforce the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was formed when the United States invaded Mexico and in essence seized not only Texas but seized New Mexico, Arizona, all the way up to California. And that is part of the United States' designs to own the hemisphere as a result of manifest destiny policies by earlier presidencies, but also New Mexico and Arizona were seen more as easement to get to California. California was a desired territory because of gold and rich agricultural soil as well as timber. New Mexico and Arizona only had horned toads, Mexicans, and Indians until mineral resources were discovered later on when it was under the territory of the United States. So the Southwest is in relation now to the United States as part of the United States territory, particularly Washington, D.C., where it had been formerly El Norte, Nuevo Mexico, or Mexico, and then what we see is New Mexico territory, because it took a while for New Mexico to become a state. And then when we look at the so-called Four Corners area, as we see mapped off again with the capitals of the different cities, and you see the state boundaries, and you can even go to, and this is one of the few places in the United States where four different countries, boy am I off my rocker today, where four different states meet in one place. And that would be right here. Now you might have, as a tourist, gone there and stood in all four states at once in this particular place. What is funny is that they've since discovered that through surveying that this is off by about 2 feet. So you might have thought you were in all four states when you were actually in just one. So you got to go back and get your picture taken. So this is still geopolitics, and what the way that we are going to talk about this region now is going to be how it would have been, and we're going to be using names that the people who were living here did not use on themselves, but we are still going to be looking at the archaeological record of people who had been here before. So as we now consider this region we call the ancient Southwest, we are going to be doing so fast forwarding a bit from the archaic and Neolithic eras into about 4,000 years ago max, as we look at a continuous occupation inhabitation of the Southwest by tribal peoples from, in essence, from about 2000 before Christ till essentially about 1200 AD, as we're talking about with the ancient inhabitants in four main culture areas that we will discuss initially. And so we would be talking about the Hohokam, who were believed to be the ancestors of the O'odham people who are in Arizona. We also will discuss the Mogollon, who are along the Mogollon Rim in New Mexico, as well as partly into Arizona, and you can find that on a map, inhabiting the region about 2000 before Christ to about 1400 AD. The Mimbres, who had distinctive styles of pots, we would be seeing is flourishing between the years 1100 to 1400 AD, and then people formerly known as Anasazi, who are now referred to as ancestral Pueblo cultures, from about the years 2800 before Christ to 1200 AD. So these are the four main culture areas that we look at, and we're just doing a very brief survey of this. If you wanted to learn more, there are courses such as Artistic Traditions of the Southwest that zero much more in detail and for more elaborated periods of time on the more elongated periods of time on the various prehistoric tribal peoples of the Southwest. Now, this region that we call the Southwest then is still pretty diverse ecological, in that it can go from a very deep desert to a high plains desert to high mountains and forested areas and large grassy areas. So it's a really diverse region, and we find out that people's adaptive strategies, ways that they subsist, are going to fit the region in which they live. And so if we're looking at the Sonoran Desert in Arizona to High Plains Desert, plateaus, mountains, and forests in New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, that we find out that different tribal peoples adopted to these regions very easily. Now, when people think of a desert, they often think of this, this really desolate place. The desert is a living ecosystem, and people who live in deserts have adapted their lifestyles to living in deserts. And so it's just, it's not this barren place. It may be barren based on your cultural perspective, but there are people who quite well thrived in what would be considered deep desert. And this can persist even to contemporary time. But you find out that when people choose to do this, that they are actually in smaller groups, what we would call either family or band level of organization. Because in a desert you have to move over a much larger area to get enough calories to survive. You have to be acutely aware of water, but there are adaptive strategies to do so. So you'll find that you can even, we'll find people who are living in what we would call high plains deserts were very effective at utilizing agriculture, and that is because of their mastery over water catchment as well as water movement and water preservation systems of not only preserving water but irrigating with water. So water, once again, being the very basis of any type of cultural sustenance. It is our base human need beyond oxygen. So, as I'd mentioned just a little bit previously, because it was an arid climate, it allowed works of very ancient people, including fiber arts, to be preserved very well, and that's why we're spending just a little bit more time here, because some of the things that we'll talk about will be discussed in future lessons too. But we've in essence got about a 3,000 to 4,000 year continuous culture history that we can look at, and we are just doing very small snapshots as we examine this in this class and within this quick 2-lesson sequence. Now, desert dwellers tend to be hunter-gatherers, and one of the things that I want to really reinforce to people is that being purely hunting is, for humans, a very difficult existence, because it requires a lot of calories to chase game down. That's why when people are hunters, they also gather. And you'll get, and what ends up being is most of the calories that people take in are not going to be from meat. They're going to be from vegetable harvesting, or vegetal harvesting, which is going to be nuts, berries, fruits, grasses, grains, and seeds. That's going to be where the bulk of the calories that we need to survive are going to come from. And then And when you're a hunter-gatherer, it also means that you've really got to know your environment. In essence, we could say they were like earth scientists. Our earth scientists. They weren't bumbling from cactus to cactus looking for water. There weren't skulls all over the place from people who died looking for water holes. People knew where everything was, and they ranged wider areas to get to the places where things would be when they knew they would be there. Because you have to know when certain plants would appear. You'd have to know when water would be rich in a certain area, and then when it would be dry. These are all strategies that people adapt. They were very empirical in the way that they observed their environment, but also looked at movements of the heavens, because if you pay attention to constellations, you start to realize that the constellations are in sync with the seasons. If you pay attention to where the sun rises and sets and where the moon rises and sets, you'll realize that that is in sync with the seasons too. So people guided their lives by movements of the heavens. You need to be able to do this in order to be agricultural, because you need to know when the growing seasons are going to be best. You do this by watching the stars, watching the sun. So non-desert peoples were agricultural, with corn, beans, squash, and chilies being the primary crops, but also melons, and then other food plants that were introduced, as well as wild plants, such as different types of wild spinach, wild leeks, wild onions. There are a whole range of wild cabbages that can be harvested. Even purslane is an amazing dish in the Southwest. These are all things that people would have harvested to eat. So it also means, though, that people are going to be traveling great distances by foot, south into Mexico, east into North Texas, as well as into Oklahoma. As a result of this great distance that people traveled, they were engaged in a huge amount of trade, trading for copper, buffalo hides, macaw feathers, shell ornaments. Salt was an important commodity. That there was an extensive amount of trade, as well as lapidaries, precious stones were traded over great distances. And that's why this is one of these nexus areas, because we find things that were produced in other parts of the country here in New Mexico and vice versa, as well as down into Mexico. So the existence here was far from being this sparse bumbling from cactus to cactus. The people were very healthy. People ate well, they drank well, and led comparatively long lives. And so and this goes counter to what we often think about, desert dwellers. Well, if you think about desert dwellers as being these bumbling people, it reflects your city upbringing more so than the actuality. But the existence that would have been in earlier times, at this about 2000 BC, and a little bit earlier, the good old days in the caves. And we find these all throughout Arizona, as well as in New Mexico, as well as up into Colorado and Utah. And when tribes were fortunate enough to find caves that were raised off the ground, they became sites for such settlements, such as among the ancestral Pueblo that we would call Mesa Verde, for example, which is in essence a cave that's in a cliffside. And we find this all over the Southwest. So caves are some of the earliest places that we would find evidence of human habitation. We would find the hearths that people cooked with. We would find evidence for what they ate. We'd also find in their feces, fossilized feces, what are called coprolites. We'd find evidence of what they ate, and then on the walls of the caves themselves, we'd find evidence of the way they viewed the cosmos, viewed the world around them, and indeed even viewed themselves. So as we would have been looking at the interior of a cave, as well as on various canyon walls and cliff walls, particularly if those surfaces were out of the light, which deteriorates pigments very quickly, we'd find evidence such as these pictographic handprints performed by the person by dipping their hand in some type of pigment and then pressing it against the surface of the wall. And this particular set of prints from the year about 100 BC remarkably preserved in its detail as well as the color, due to the fact that it was out of the light, but it's also an arid climate. We call these pictographs, although they were done with someone's hand, and we assume that they were done to communicate something. And a pictograph, in essence, is a picture that is intended to communicate some type of message, and it refers particularly to pre-literate societies, right? Societies where there isn't a written language, and this might be one of the ways that people communicated messages. So we make that assumption. There are very few random acts of painting. Even what we might consider to be graffiti in contemporary time isn't random. Right, that there are decisions made to communicate some type of message. So this cave painting, pictographic painting from Utah, would have been found in one of these cave shelters from that period well over 2,000 years ago. Another cave painting that we would call, if we would use this term, polychrome. Chrome relating to color, poly relating to many. This one found in Arizona. We see that cave painting itself then is a widespread phenomenon within this region we call the Southwest. And by looking at those designs, you would also, once we start to look at ceramics and other arts produced in the Southwest, you'd see that those patterns that are produced on that cave painting were reproduced on ceramics and even later on textiles. So just a few examples of pictographic aspects of creative impulse in the Southwest. Now we're going to differentiate then between pictograph and petroglyph. And a petroglyph is in essence an image that's carved into stone. And the word itself comes from Greek. Petros meaning stone, glyph meaning carve. And so what we can glean from these petroglyphs is not only that they were carved into stone, and then we can see them easily 2,000 years later, and that because they were carved into stone, what we'll see is a little bit of the surface that it gets as a result of being in the weather, and the images may fade just a little bit from the time they were rendered, but because there's no pigment involved, they still stay pretty resilient. And by also looking at these images, we also get an idea of the hairstyle. If you look to the far left of how people's hair would have looked, you can also see the person wearing a manta, and then we can even get an idea of the kind of jewelry people might have been wearing if we look to the image at the far right, the type of way that people would have been adorning themselves. And pay attention to that particular design that you see as what appears to be a necklace or a collar on that individual, and also pay attention to the design of the manta that we see, or the wraparound that we see on the individual to the left, because we'll see these reproduced in actual art that will be recovered from, for example, Chaco Canyon, but we would also see being made into contact and post-contact period with Spain. So just remember those forms, because they will come back at you before the end of this lesson. We see here a horned serpent, which is on the right, and that is a petroglyph once again. And it is something that we see as a carryover possibly from a message that could have come up from Mexico. But if you've ever been in the Southwest and you see those millipedes that also they look like really long horns on them, it may be a representation of that, and you don't want to be on the business end of one of those because it has a pretty intense sting. Now they're not going to chase you down to bite you because they use that sting to paralyze things that they may eat, or when they're in combat. You're too big to eat. So generally if you get stung by one of these, it's because they feel threatened. And then you see the figure to the left of that looks like a dancing Christmas tree bulb. We assume that it's some type of spiritual being, possibly a predecessor to a gachina, the masked dancers, and then later on, and the masked dancers being representations of the spiritual beings that live in the mountain peaks and that come down and live among human beings at different times of the year throughout the Southwest. So these are cosmological pictures that we assume that the ancient peoples were creating as a way of representing the world as they saw it, not only in the physical but in the corporeal aspect of the world around them. And I would say these were akin to or similar to paintings that we would have seen and markings that we'd see in Europe from back a good probably 20,000 years earlier, though, when we look at Altamura or Lascaux, the cave paintings in France as well as in Spain. That would have been done at a time when even the Homo sapiens were living as contemporaries of Neanderthals. So this is 20,000 years later, but the urge for people to express their cosmology we see as a human, we might say a cultural universal around the world, the way that people represent their view of the cosmos in earlier societies up to modern time. As we describe the Hohokam, who inhabited the area from around 300 BC to about 1400 AD, and the O'odham language reflecting somewhat those who have gone is what it translates to. We're living in the arid desert areas of southern Arizona and northern Mexico. Once again, they didn't recognize this border. It was all the same. And they actually moved out of caves into homes, and this might actually reflect not only the change in architecture, but ways that it could be preserved in mythologies. We talk about movement through worlds, that the actual the world itself could have been the style of dwellings in which people were living too. That the earlier style of home that we would have seen constructed would be something like a portable cave. So we look at caves as the original dwellings, and then how do we make the caves portable? So the Hohokam were living in pit houses, so this is what we're going to call the portable caves. And so they're pit house villages that had a central plaza. So we also see the beginnings of the what's reproduced later on in Pueblo villages, where we see homes, in this case that are above the ground though, that surround a central plaza. And it's assumed that in that central plaza it was not only a place where ceremonies were done, but it was also a place where children were, and where families themselves could watch out for the welfare of the children. Any important events were going on in this plaza. There's strong evidence of trade with Mexico, and we see that a prevailing indigenous art form is not only basketry, but also ceramics. So pit house architecture looks like this. So you have a pit that's dug into the ground. You then have a wooden frame that is then faced with sticks and then covered with a stucco. Now what's wonderful about this style of architecture is that in the summertime it's cooled by being somewhat below the surface of the earth, and then because the surface of the structure collects heat during the daytime, and the nighttime it releases the heat into the structure. And that's one of the wonderful things about adobes and this style of architecture in the Southwest, is that it's passive cooling as well as passive heating in a desert area. So it's a very effective way for people to exist with mobile caves in these regions in the days before air conditioners. So as we examine these Hohokam ceramics, one of the things that we look at as a stylistic convention is that when you see that spiral design with the Hohokam red on white jar from around the year 950 to 1150, you'll see that spiraling design interspersed with bars as well as what we might call chevrons along with that. And then you see the design to the lower left, and you'll see that spiral design as well as the repetitive designs that are very similar to what you see executed in a different way to the one on the upper right. These are what we would call stylistic conventions, the way those spirals are rendered and how they are appendages to the longer, somewhat rectangular forms that are interspersed with each other at right angles. This also shows you the incredible sophistication and design that people were achieving in ceramics with their redware at this particular time. And this when we're looking at artistic traditions that would make their way into other societies, we will see vestiges of this in the ceramics of other societies in the Southwest that would come at later times. And it includes not only the form of the vessels, but even some of the patterns that are used and the way that they are arranged. We have an incised shell frog from about the year 900. And so you can see the frog's posterior as the wide part of the shell. You can see the frog's eyes. You can see its mouth more toward the bottom of the slide, and then you see its front appendages. Now, what does this tell you when you find a seashell out in the middle of the Sonoran Desert of Arizona? Last I checked, there wasn't any oceanfront property in Arizona for about 4 million years or so. So what does this tell you when you find a shell that far inland? Some of the artistic commonalities that we'll see with later peoples then, which will include Mogollon, Mimbres, Ancestral Pueblo, right up through contemporary time, is that they tended to have sheltered architecture, and even when they were doing the pit houses, they tended to do them near cliff sides then, with an acute awareness of the sun's movement. So for the best sun, you want to make sure that the areas you want heated have a southern facing when we're in the northern hemisphere. So they're well aware of this, and so because they're using passive solar energy for cooling and heating. That you would also find later on cut stone buildings with wood support that would be faced with a mud stucco, and that is for they're cool in the day, warm at night, and then in the summertime you'd still have them warm throughout the whole day because they would also have fires inside to stay warm. That once we move a little bit more forward, we're going to find kivas that most probably had murals painted on them based on later excavations that were done. We'll find basketry and pottery. We'll find petroglyphs and rock painting. And then a lot of the art actually suggests a strong orientation to water. And that's something that we see in the Southwest, with it being such an arid zone, that people are very intensely fixated on water, more so than, and for different reasons than you would find in the Northeast, where water is abundant. And so when we're looking at some of these artistic commonalities that we do, to some degree, we can say to ourselves, even with this orientation to water, that to some degree that there is some type of environmental determinism involved in the way that cultures adapt to their environments. And then the imagery that we see, as well as the strategies that they use to produce food and to survive, and even have population centers for extended periods of time. So as we move to the Mogollon from about the years 2000 before Christ to 1400 AD, this would be along the Mogollon Rim and Plateau. Now they also lived in pit houses, villages, and they started to modify these to more contiguous. So where you saw the earlier model there, it was a single solitary unit. What you start to see with the Mogollon is they build a number of these units right next to each other, so they are connected to each other, and they become above ground rooms like the Pueblo structures. Now many of them are single story, but you start to see them these long complexes then, what we might almost call single story apartment buildings. We also see the beginnings of shallow ceremonial kivas. We'll see that most of the villages are going to be built on high mesas, bluffs, or ridges. Now, why do you think people would build their villages on high places? Because it takes a lot of effort to move timber up to these areas when you're using timber, and a good amount of effort to climb them, as well as having to build steps to make your way up to them. What does this tell you when you see villages built above in essence, what would be the surface of the desert, on mesas and the like? They were doing digging stick farming that would be supplemented by hunting and gathering. So we see some of the domestic plants, and it's suggested even some domesticated animals, such as turkeys. And digging stick, in essence, is poking a hole in the ground and dropping seeds in, and then also fertilizer. You're not turning over a lot of soil. Plow-style agriculture is not really a good idea in the Southwest because, for one, it's windy a good part of the year, and when you turn the soil over, it loses its moisture very quickly. So you disturb as little of the ground as possible as an adaptive strategy for agriculture. And they had expert water usage, water catchment, and water usage strategies. And this is by 2000 BC. So the mesa top, what we would call the adobe style of architecture. This shows you the single-story homes. It's built on a mesa top, though, and then you see that the way that you get into the homes is not through a door on the side, but often a hole in the roof. And then you can see just at the bottom of the image itself, you'll see a wooden frame that would be covered over and would be the beginning of a very shallow kiva. And then you see the plaza in which that kiva is setting. So this is a prototype for what we would see in the way that later peoples would be constructing their villages. And then the fields themselves, if you look just to the left, you'll see the beginnings of agriculture there. And the fields would be close to the homes themselves. And within this, then, once you start having agriculture, you need to have ways to preserve as well as prepare, refine what you're doing. And then you see the development of basketry. You see the development of the fiber arts beyond basketry, which will include cotton. And then you'll see the development of ceramics for not only food serving, but food storage for food preparation. So in a very real way, many of the arts that we consider arts today were a direct result of food procurement strategies. And so but if you're going to be procuring food, you might as well do so with things that look visually pleasing. And we find this also as a cultural universal around the world. And we see two different types of baskets here. Although they're considered bags, they are still woven baskets. One of them is a more pliable basket, the storage bag, because it's, you can tell even by the form, it's going to be a little bit more pliable. And then the one that's a burden basket is, because you're carrying things, it's going to be made of a much more stiff plant fiber because you're actually putting more weight in it and you're hanging it. What it has on the, what looks like a handle on it is actually what we would call a tump line. And the tump line is the strap that, as you're carrying the basket would sit somewhat in the small of your back, and then what looks like a handle would actually be running across your forehead. So you'd be using the muscles of your neck and then with that handle against your forehead to hold that basket up as you walked, as compared to the storage bag, which would either hang on your shoulder or would be carried in your hand. So these are two different food procurement as well as later on water procurement strategies that we would see. And so what were very pragmatic purposes in the beginning would become more articulated and decorated into pragmatic, artistic creations. Early ceramics that we see, micaceous bowl to the left. And one of the things about micaceous clay is that it not only fires much more, you might say hard, but that once it's fired, it's a very good heating implement because the mica flecks in it also hold heat and then release it into whatever you are cooking. And the cooking done in that day would have either had a pot suspended over the fire, or in an earlier time you would have had the pot sitting there with liquid in it, and then people would drop hot stones into the liquid to heat the water, and then would drop meat and other grains and vegetal matter in it to cook. And a lot of what people would have been eating as early grains would have been eaten more like a gruel. So the grains would have been pounded and then water added, and then more of a gruel, or like a cornmeal like you see today when you're looking at atole. But the way that water would have been heated would have been hot stones, and then the water poured over the hot stones to make it boil. When you're looking at the vessel to the right, this is the form of what would be called a olla, something to carry water. It would have a dimpled impression underneath so that the person who is carrying that vessel could put it on top of their head, and the dimple would fit right to their head to make it easier to carry. But remember I mentioned some of the designs from the cave walls earlier start to make their way into the ceramics. So we see early adornment of ceramics beyond what we see with micaceous. and different painting as well as type of glazes that people would use on the ceramics to beautify the ceramic ware. Now when we move to the Mimbres, this is going to be a very interesting case study in iconography or pictography in ceramics. Now the Mimbres along the Mimbres River in New Mexico, and they're known in particular for their pottery vessels and would have been prominent around the years 850 to 1200 AD, or what we call Common Era CE. Now their most common designs are black on a white slip, and we'll talk about, when we talk more about ceramics in the next lesson, what a slip is when it relates to pottery. And then the imagery itself, though, it gives us snapshots of the way they viewed the world and everyday life. Now, one of the things that we also know with the Mimbres is many of the bowls were ritually killed during significant events. They were actually broken. Possibly the dish represented a sky dome, and that bowls were also broken, and not only at the end of very long pilgrimages, but were also buried with individuals, and then they would be broken on top of the individual. Perhaps by breaking a vessel, it makes it unusable in this world, but usable to someone while they are in the next world. This is another one of the things we see as cultural universals, is that around the world that people put things for people to use, and the living put things for the dead to use in the afterlife. So we see a good amount of cultural innovation with their ceramics. We also assume that they were more settled because they're using less basketry, and it's very difficult to travel great distances carrying pots. And usually if you did, it was to trade them with someone else who might have had goods that you needed. So this exchange, or this movement of ideas between peoples, is going to bring new techniques as well as materials to different areas. And we see that the techniques as well as the different heating temperatures that people could achieve actually is going to cause some of these technological innovations as people become more expert at creating hotter fire. And when you can create hotter fires, your pottery hardens much better. And it'll also allow you to do different kinds of adornment based on the hardness of that pottery. And then we have to ask ourselves, what does the imagery itself tell us? So in the next subsection, we look at some of the imagery that has both astounded and puzzled art historians and anthropologists in contemporary time, such as these two black on white vessels. Now if you look at the vessel to the upper left, you see an astounding design sense of what we would call not only figure ground reversal, because you can't tell whether it is bird figures in the white that are represented, or is it spiritual figures that all are joined at one head in black, and four of them altogether sharing one head. It's a pretty amazing design sense that you see there, in the way that you have two different kinds of figures represented in fours as figure ground. You also see to the vessel and to the lower right. What does that design remind you of? Now, mind you, this vessel was created somewhere about the year 1000 AD. What does this vessel, that design, remind you of? And you see, so not only the spiral designs, but also what are called hatch marks that are done, these fine lines that are drawn to give a little bit more presence to the space on the white slip. You'll also note that both of these vessels have what are called kill holes. Those were how the vessels were broken to make them unusable in this world. If we look at three polychrome dishes, once again, polychrome meaning more than one color, we again get this sense of astounding design. We might see the beginnings of a Zia sign in the one to the upper right, but also, so it's not only in the red, the black, and the white, and then the hatch marks to give the design more presence. It also gives it that sense of vibrating visual appeal. These same designs would make their way into textiles later on. If you look to the central figure with "I'm Batman," you see a bat figure, a composite being of a human and a bat and a Gachina face. All right, so this is composite being. And then you'll note that the patterns underneath the wings would also appear in textiles later on. When you look at the vessel to the lower right, these same patterns would appear not only in other ceramics, but in textiles later on, and of the day too. So we see these polychrome vessels, pictures of not only their sense of design sense, but also the cosmos. But we also get a sense of everyday life. If you look in the upper right, you see the figure, you'll see they have fish bones there laying on the ground. And you also see the figure in black that is wearing a sash, the one who's seated. You'll see that sash, and if it is a sash, it was made of cotton, woven cotton on a backstrap loom. You'll also note their hairstyle. Their hairstyle in contemporary time would be called a chongo. And you see then that the hairstyle persists from a long time ago. And then to the lower right, you see turkeys and armadillos, rendered in negative as compared to positive in this sense. So we get their picture of the world as they viewed each other, as well as they viewed wildlife around them. And in these two vessels, we see that in the one you've got humans climbing a tree. It looks like to get either pigeons or turkeys in the upper right, and then and you'll see they have bow and arrow on the ground beneath them. This tells you the kind of technology that they had available to them also. You'll see in the one to the upper left also a man is holding in essence a ladder up against the tree, so the man who's higher up on the tree can climb higher, possibly to snitch eggs or possibly to grab the birds themselves. In the lower right, this has been interpreted several different ways, because it's been interpreted that they are acrobats who are balancing on either logs or rubber balls, or they are actually ball players. We know that the ball game was being played in the Southwest. We find the same eye-shaped courts in southern New Mexico as well as in southern Arizona. So we know the Hohokam people were playing the ball game. We see the same ball courts, and here we might even suggest if these aren't logs and if they are actual rubber balls, what does that tell you? Are there rubber trees in New Mexico? As we look at this obsidian knife from what would be considered archaic era, and it's one of the few things that we'll look at from that period, and that is to show the continuity with which the region that we're going to be looking at, Chaco Canyon, had been occupied. So this obsidian knife that was somewhere approximately between 2900 to 900 BC of obsidian, and obsidian would have been a very precious material because it would have been the sharpest edge with which someone could have worked in that time period. It's like volcanic glass and has a very sharp edge. The edge is so sharp that there are even some blades that are used in contemporary surgeries that are made of obsidian glass. And so this is a referent to how continuously occupied this region was, just to reinforce that notion of a so-called desert area having been populated for so long. Now the ancestral Pueblo, as I said, they'd been called Anasazi, but that's fallen out of usage. From about the years 2800 to 2800 BC to 1200 AD, were spread out, dispersed over regions of what we call the Four Corners area. The earliest settlements would have been in caves, as we mentioned earlier, as well as in the cliff wall recesses that I mentioned earlier, and then the pit houses, and then what we would see as multi-story structures, and even structures set up in caves that are set in canyon walls up above the ground and on mesa tops. By about 700 AD, they were farming and were developing ceramics and building stone houses. And among the things they would have been growing would have been cotton, corn, bean, and squash, and may have had some domestic birds. They created fine jewelry as well as cloth for trade, and we'll look at the jewelry in a little bit. There were also major roadworks that led to and from Chaco, which are more visible from aerial photos than they are from the actual surface of the canyon itself. And for some reason, between 1130 and 1150 to about 1200, many of the towns along this Chaco Wash that we're going to talk about were vacated. So the name has been said to mean ancient enemies, and that's not the way you would describe yourself if you are a Pueblo person. That's why ancestral Pueblo is the terminology more used now. But we find at Chaco, as well as at other ancestral Pueblo sites, records of cosmology in the sacred space, which includes the kiva, the architecture, as well as on canyon walls, as well as, and it would be represented in several different ways, as we'll look at in a few moments. The canyon was probably a major center for ceremony, ritual, and pilgrimage. Now, there were 300 separate building compounds that have been mapped out in this region, but it's difficult to tell the population size. One of the things that has been determined in recent years is that buildings and many other works are particularly oriented to the movements of the sun as well as the moon. Once again, if you are going to be an agricultural population, you need to be attentive to the skies, because the skies in a very real way are an agricultural clock. As we hinted at earlier in the semester when we were in Mesoamerica, for example, when we were looking at that pyramid of Kulkan, and when we saw it at the equinox when the serpent was portrayed on the steps in the shadow and the light. So, as was mentioned, it was an architectural complex of roads, buildings, and kivas, a center for intertribal contact that was along this what is now a dry riverbed, reinforcing once again when you have congested populations that you need to have a ready source of water. The buildings themselves were made of cut stone, and they were multi-story structures that were reinforced with wood beams that were carried from forests at least 50 miles away. This is a decided effort in order to build this ceremonial center. And this is what also lends credence to the idea that it had to have been a very important area for people to invest this much human labor to carry this much timber to the area. Although, ironically and quizzically, many of the buildings appear to have been sparsely inhabited, if they were inhabited at all. That there are rooms that they found in the excavations that actually had no entries to them. And if there were a lot of people living in the buildings, you would find residue from smoke, for example, of the fires that were in them. And many of the buildings don't have any of this present, and that's why it's also thought that some of this might have been. Some of the buildings might have actually been built in order to reinforce, to instill a sense of awe in people who visit by the sheer size. Many of the buildings also built against the sides of the cliff walls, which would exaggerate their size. When we think about Rappaport's notion of ritual space and ceremonial and shaped space, when we're looking at the second level of importance there, where their importance is given based on scale and location, that's being reinforced here, and then based on the usage we see to the third level, this places where rituals and ceremonies are performed. And then right around 1100 to 1200 AD, it becomes depopulated. Based on dendrochronology now, which is the study of tree rings, they know that there was an intense drought that lasted for well over 100 years in the area, and it's still really dry there. And that's, if you don't have water, you can't support a large population. So people moved out from that area into various pueblos, it's assumed, that we see in contemporary time. So showing you how a building would be built against a cliffside, and it's a multi-story building. The cliffside would lend support at the anterior wall, at the very back. But if you look at this, you'll see that it's made of cut and shaped stone into the walls themselves, and then you know that it was at least 2 stories tall, because if you look almost dead center of the image, you'll see what appears to be black spaces, black rectangles, or black I'm sure you can see them. I wish I could point and have you show it on the screen here. Those are the beams, the wooden beams. That's what's left after the beams have rotted, where those were between the stories. So you had these tall walls and then wooden floors in between them, and they added support not only from the back of the cliff wall, but added support to the multi-story structures that were also roofed. The stones themselves would have been, as you see the walls of the structure here, would have been covered with a stucco. And I want to reinforce once again passive heating and cooling, that during the day the walls would collect heat from the sun, and in the evening would release the heat into the structure. And at the same time, during the daytime, especially if you've ever been to Chaco Canyon, it's intensely hot in between those canyon walls. And so it would have been a cool place during the hot daytime. But you can get an idea of the relative thickness of the walls too here at Ungopavi. And this is only one of the, we're not going to look at very many of the structures here. It's just to give you an illustration. You can find many more of the images online of the architecture at Chaco Canyon. But we see evidence of cosmology in the architecture. Now, among societies that didn't use the wheel, the cosmos is often visualized as layers, and we talked about the different worlds, including the way that the Maya viewed layers of creation and layers of heavens. We also see levels or worlds. So rather than doing a 360, we see, as you know, looking all around us horizontally, you see people in movement upward. Now, the contemporary Pueblo religion notes the existence of 3 dome-like worlds that are below this one. So as part of the story of emergence, the ancestors' journey through the previous 3, and we're now in the 4th world. And this story is recalled in architecture and stories that carry forward through today. And then we also see at Chaco that the architectural layout of many of the buildings seems to mirror, based on different wall facings as well as different phenomena that occur, that seem to mirror or pay attention to the movements of the heavens. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So Pueblo Bonito is aligned not only with the solstices, but it also is aligned to movements of the moon. And there's a very good film that was produced by Robert Redford that features work that was done by Anna Sofer, an artist who was actually doing some work at Chaco when she discovered something really startling. And then based on what she saw at a place called Fajada Butte, actually did a lot of investigation with a team of archaeologists and anthropologists as well as Hopi and Pueblo officials to really get a stronger understanding of what was nested cosmologically at Chaco. But we see this as a huge building complex, which is punctuated not only by the buildings you see along the D that you hear, but you can also see a complex of kivas that we'll look at from an aerial view in just a moment. So this being, if you were standing looking at Pueblo Bonito from a place that's called Alto Mesa, and you're looking down at the structure, this is what you would see. However, from a bird's eye view, you can see in the upper right the cliff face that you were looking down at Pueblo Bonito as well as Pueblo Bonito, and then in the lower left you see all of these kivas, and there are a vast amount of kivas that show there must have been an intense amount of ceremonial activity that was going on here, and it's suggested that it occurred at certain times of the year. So people made pilgrimages here. These kivas would have been filled by different clans, different societies, all doing their own ceremonies, their different rituals, possibly that the world would continue, and then the populations would disperse again. And but this is a huge complex, and once again I encourage you to visit the Chaco Canyon site, the link of which I've provided in the lesson. Casa Rinconada, which is a large kiva. This shows you an aerial view of the kiva structure, and it would have been a covered structure, so there would have been wooden posts that were in the kiva floor that would have supported the cross beams for a roof that would have been covered with the timber that I told you about, and then would have been covered with a stucco and then dirt. And then you also see along it places for where the fire holes were, and then the smoke holes would be, as well as the people where people would enter and leave. And this has a strong, just slightly off north-south orientation. And it's suggested, because the sky looks different today, believe it or not, than it did 1,000 years ago, that the position of the stars in the heavens has shifted slightly based on the fact that the Earth wobbles, even though it spins on its axis. There's a slight wobble. So even what we see now as a North Star, in about 10,000 years will no longer be the North Star. And for that matter, what we see is the Big Dipper will look like a big shovel. Because the stars themselves are also in motion. But as the Earth wobbles on its axis, what we see as the North Star isn't going to be there because of this wobble. But it's assumed that possibly this orientation of this kiva would have been oriented based on how people viewed the North Star and where it would have appeared in the year 1200, or actually earlier than 1200. Now the symbolism then in the kivas, we see that the entrance of the most of the ancestral kivas was oriented to the east, and then the structural form of it is a part of the Pueblo four-world universe. That the Shipapu, which is the small hole in the floor of a kiva that leads to the first world, alright, that's what it's representative of. The floor level itself is considered a metaphor for the second world, where humans emerged. And then the raised seat ledge would represent the third world, and then the ladder to the roof and then the rising smoke itself would represent the emergence into the fourth world of human beings, this fourth world that we occupy today. And we see that, so the kiva itself has in many ways a story built into it cosmologically, much the same way that a church, believe it or not, a Roman Catholic church has in its architecture a story built into it, and that includes the church being representative of an ark, that you enter the ark from the west in essence and you head toward the east standing for salvation and eternal life. So you're entering from the west, which is in essence the place of death and damnation. So you're getting on this ark, and then you, as you move forward, as you move more toward where the priest is, you'll see that the church originally looked like a long rectangular building, and then what we now see as the apses or the appendages on a church grew longer, not only to represent the crucifix but also to give places for very important people to sit. But we see stories built into the architecture that represent the cosmology of people around the world. So whether it be the kiva, whether it be a church, whether it be a big house, whether it be the big houses in Papua New Guinea, which represent the womb, they all have cosmological and spiritual meaning that we see once again as a cultural universal. And so this view of the great kiva at Chetro a kiva that would have seated more than 200 people, and so there aren't random acts of kiva building. And then for a kiva to be this large, it does show that there had to have been a large number of people here at one time, and then they would have dispersed afterwards. Because one of the things they don't find present in Chaco, unless the people took it away with them, is you don't find the presence of a lot of middens or garbage dumps, garbage heaps. They do find them scattered, but if this was a vastly, heavily populated area, you'd find a lot of garbage, unless we had very early litter laws in the Southwest in the days of the people of the ancestral Pueblo. And we'll look a little bit more at architecture as well as artistic forms in the next section of this lecture. Something striking from Chaco Canyon, and that we have reference to in other societies around the world. We'll start first by saying that in July 1054 AD, a massive star in the constellation that we now call Taurus exploded and became known as the Crab Nebula. And that phenomena was observed around the world. And it was a supernova that was visible in broad daylight, and it would have been the brightest astronomical object visible from the Earth besides the sun and moon. And this includes in broad daylight. People would have been able to see this. So people around the world observed this with great wonder, awe. Some even saw it as a sign of the end of times. Right, that the world itself was coming to an end, and others saw it as a beginning, others saw it as a message from the heavens. But we also know that the Chinese recorded this in great detail, and that it was visible by day for 23 days, almost a month. You could see this in the daytime, and then by night for 653 days, which is almost 2 years, you would have seen this blotch in the heavens. And so the Chinese, who were expert astronomers, astute astronomers, also recorded this. And one of the things about the Chinese being so good at astronomy is what also made them good sailors, because in order to sail effectively, you have to be able to watch the heavens in order to navigate great distances on the ocean. And so their astronomy assisted them in recording this and making steady record of it. So ethnoastronomy is the way that we look at the way that ancient people, or archaeoastronomy, the way that they ordered their lives and the way they studied the heavens. And we see that there's a pictograph that was rendered on a horizontal overhang about 20 feet off the ground. And it's on an east-facing cliff face northeast of Peñasco Blanco ruin. And this is a hike off of Alto Mesa at Chaco Canyon. So you have to hike back in to see this. And then there are several images there, including a human hand. But this is 20 feet off the ground, so you'd have had to make a decided effort to get up there on a ladder in order to paint this design. But what's interesting about the design is that if we look at the calculations of the moon's orbit back to July 5th, 1054, we would know that the moon's phase was depicted waning at that time. And then if we see this painting, it shows the moon's phase waning. It also shows the orientation of the supernova as it would have appeared in the sky in relation to a waning moon at Chaco Canyon. This was done with computer simulations. And even Pigment then even suggests that they might have observed the same thing and recorded it as a sacred event. So this Penasco Blanco pictograph, where you see the hand, but you also see the crescent moon depicted in its waning stage, as well as that what could be a star cluster to the left of the crescent moon. Now you'll also note that there is a hornet's nest to the upper right of the slide. That hornet's nest was built much after the supernova. But this shows evidence of the beginnings, possibly, or an awareness of ethnoastronomy in recording sacred events, not only on cliff walls, but embedded in architecture itself. Because now, when we look at Fajada Butte, which is in the upper left, which you can't get up there to anymore, because of the discovery and then the later on traffic of people up there that could disrupt what you see in the lower right. You see 3 stone slabs that are leaning against that wall, and those 3 stone slabs have become part of a focal point for what is known as a sun dagger. Now, a sun dagger is a dagger of light that when it shines through those 3 stone slabs at different times of the year, it's oriented toward that spiral petroglyph now that you see on the right hand side of the image. And what this dagger does is at different times of the year it either bisects that spiral or appears at either side of the, it frames the spiral in these light. And what's interesting is that it occurs during the equinoxes and during the solstices. Now we also see a similar phenomenon repeated, either sun daggers or where the light affects petroglyphs at other ruins, such as at Yellow Jacket Ruin as well as Hovenweep. And then we also see a phenomenon with the moon at Chimney Rock up in Colorado near Mesa Verde. So we see this once again, that people were paying attention to the sun and the moon as a way of ordering their life, and then it became part of and this is up on a butte. All right, so there's some effort made to climb up there, and perhaps it was so that there would be nothing in the way to prevent a clear access to the sun in order to record this event. And we know based on reports later on that important people in the Zuni and different Pueblo and Hopi people, an important responsibility was to be aware of the equinoxes and the solstices, because you planned your whole ceremonial calendar as well as your planting and harvest calendar around them. So you see the sun dagger here, and at summer solstice it actually pierces the center of that spiral. During the spring equinox it's just off the center of the spiral. At fall equinox it's just off the center of the spiral, and at the winter solstice you see 2 sun daggers. So there aren't random acts of laying slabs of stone on cliff sides that are that far off the ground. So it does show you that they're paying attention to and have a very strong orientation toward time. And this being represented then in a petroglyph and then a painting of light, we could say, within this petroglyph. But it wasn't just petroglyphs that people at Chaco were doing. We see they were doing weaving with fiber. So this ancestral Pueblo yucca sandal. So it's woven yucca. And we see that, and the reason it survived so well from about the year 700 to 1200 is because it was such an arid climate that even though it's an organic fiber, it didn't deteriorate. There are cotton textiles from this time period that look dang near like the day they were made, depending on where they were found. We see also ceramics, and if you remember the black on white ceramics of the Mimbres and some of the designs that were in the Mimbres ceramics that were more of the geographic designs, you see similar designs here among the ancestral Pueblo. And we'd also see that some of these designs would be carried over into textiles from different tribes throughout the Southwest. You also see various kinds of servingware themselves, whether they be chili bowls, whether they be large dough bowls, or whether they be ladles. We see that they've adopted different ceramics to different utilities and adorned them at the same time. Here we see different water vessels and what looks, well, you could almost say it looks like a coffee mug. And by the way, if you've ever gone into any of the southwestern cutlery stores and you see these coffee mugs that have southwestern patterns such as this on them, there were actually ones that looked like that found at Chaco Canyon, and the ones you see in the stores are just knockoffs of the originals. That they had a very wide range of forms as they were creating ceramic vessels. And these were all hand built. They were doing this without the use of a potter's wheel, and they were doing it with the use of a puki, which would have been a small shell that was rounded, and then you would build it up with coils, the clay built up with coils. We'll talk about more of that in the next lesson when we talk about ceramic as well as other fiber arts and basketry in the Southwest. So this is showing you ceramics also at Chaco Canyon. And then I wanted to zero in on this image here. Do you remember that design that I pointed out to among the Mimbres and said, what does that remind you of? What does the design around the neck of this Oya remind you of? Once again, it's done in the 11th century, but it would be a design that by the time our parents are alive would become one that would be reviled based on the way that a certain political government adopted that design. We also know that they were working lapidary, so this turquoise and argillite, but they also worked with jet. They worked with jade that was traded up from Mexico, and so they weren't just using the shaped and cut stones, but they were also tumbling them and grinding them to make these discoid beads, such as you see with the restrung necklace on the lower right. They were also getting spondylus shell. Now, where does spondylus shell come from? And once again, there weren't any oceanfront properties at Chaco Canyon. So what does this tell you about movement in that time period? There were also macaw feathers found at Chaco Canyon and other parts of New Mexico. This copper bell with a tinkler is direct evidence of trade good with northern Mexico, and you see bells of the similar form being made of gold, silver, as well as copper in Mexico among the Zapotec as well as the Nahuatl, or the Aztec, as well as among the Maya. So this recovered from Pueblo Alto at Chaco Canyon, and so that it was probably used during dance, all right, and it makes that jingling sound. This pendant of geotite shows also a sense. It's an avian design, as we would call it. It's a bird design worn as a pendant. Shows you that there was a lot of jewelry, a lot of personal adornment that was going on at Chaco Canyon. Now I wanted to bring this to your attention because of a petroglyph that I mentioned earlier. Do you remember that necklace that I pointed out in the petroglyph from about the year 200? And then you see this wood slat necklace from about 1,000 years later that was recovered at Chaco Canyon. But you'll also note that it has paint on it, the paint itself being mineral paint. And so by either grinding up turquoise or finding clay that had a lot of copper in it to get the greens, as well as a lot of iron in it to get the ferrous oxide to create these rust reds on these wooden slats. So this was a wooden slat necklace found at Chaco Canyon, once again reinforcing aesthetic that carries forth and aesthetic influence that carries forth through geography and through time. And then these turquoise inlaid earrings. Now they didn't have hoops, but instead would use twine or cord through pierced ears in order to hang these earrings from the ears. And you'll see dead set in the center of these earrings is shell, reinforcing once again, and it's abalone, by the way. Where does abalone come from? And do you find abalone readily out in the High Plains desert? What does this tell you? As was mentioned earlier in the lecture, that people were growing cotton in the Southwest. Something about New World cotton as compared to Old World cotton is that the cotton is a longer fiber, which allowed people to spin it much finer in such a way that textiles that were woven in the Americas, when the Spanish first encountered them, thought the textiles were silk, because it felt very different than the cotton garments they were wearing, that would be akin to wearing burlap, I guess, because it was a short fiber Egyptian cotton. But New World cotton with the long fiber spun into very, very fine thread, and you could have a very high, and we'll talk about warp and weft count in just a moment, but you could spin it so finely and then weave it so finely that it had a very smooth, very pleasing, tactile sense to it as people wore garments worn with cotton of the Americas. So by about 1000 AD or Common Era, southwestern peoples were growing cotton, and they were also using an upright loom. And there are items that were found earlier in Mesoamerica, when I was talking about weaving in Mesoamerica as well as weaving in South America, and reinforcing a very long, continuous tradition of weaving in the hemisphere. By around 1100 AD or Common Era, it was cultivated in the Rio Grande Valley. And then by the late 1500s, Spanish explorers were also noticing cotton cultivation in the area from El Paso, Texas to San Juan Pueblo, New Mexico. So as people like Juan de Oñate were coming up along the Rio Grande River, noticed that there was prolific growing of cotton, as well as corn, beans, squash, melons, and chili, as well as tobacco. People at Hopi, as well as Acoma and Zuni, were also growing cotton at that time. So, but we see that cotton actually, of this mogollon woven net, and the net being of a cotton fiber, and would have been used for several things, not only for fishing but also for snaring game. So it was not only for clothing, but had other subsistence-related importance. We get an idea also of what the garments would have looked like based on murals. This is a reconstructed mural from Coronado, Kiva, a monument at Coronado National Park, or is it a state park? Anyway, it's outside of Bernalillo, and this was a mural that was in a kiva and has been restored, and from about the year 1300 AD. And you see the man wearing a cotton sash as well as a cotton kilt, and then you also see wearing a headdress, and the headdress having many different plumages in it. Some of them would have been macaw plumage that would have come up from Mexico. And so we see that we get an idea of the type of attire that people were wearing. And what's really wonderful about this is that we see the same type of attire worn to contemporary time, reinforcing once again the notion of a continuity of culture from the ancestral Pueblo, as we see through attire, to contemporary Pueblo, who wear a very similar style of dress today. We also see the manta here, and then it's a reproduction of you see the manta itself, the woman's garment, and then the sash hanging from it, and then she has in each hand parrots, and then also has a dough bowl that she's carrying on her head, and then her face is painted like in a somewhat gachina type imagery. But this shows you that the types of patterns that people would have been weaving into their cotton garments at the time too. So weaving as this connection to ancestral Pueblo people, that we see it in the Kiva murals themselves, and then we see it in the native dress that people have during important ceremonies today. When you go to the various Pueblos for feast days, you'll see women dressed in a very similar manner. So we introduce warp and weft. Now, ancient fabrics were decorated with not only plaids, but checks, stripes, and twills. We'd start to see variations later on with the introduction of other types of dyes also, and other types of innovations. So you would achieve these variations in a weaving process. For example, when you change the sequence of warps and wefts, you can produce different designs. For example, when you're weaving, and I'll explain this again, the warp is your foundation of the textile, and the weft is the back and forth threads that you weave to create the designs. And the same way in basketry, you can either go you can weave a grass fiber around and around and around and around, going weft fiber one by one, or you can make it wind around 2 weft fibers and then around 2 weft fibers. I'll show you a diagram about that when we are discussing basketry in particular. But you could actually shape the way the design looks by how many wefts you skip, for example. But you're weaving each row from side to side. So on a horizontal loom, you're seated in front of the loom. You've got your warp fibers that are running vertical to the ground, and then your weft fibers are being woven in between the warp fibers to create the pattern and to create the actual body of the textiles. So the warp is the foundational threads of the textile. Sometimes I like to call it like the canvas upon which the designs are going to be painted. Now the warp threads are on upright looms, they're vertically run, and they might be cotton or wool. And then the weft threads are the ones that are woven into the warp to produce the designs. These are the horizontal threads that run back and forth across the warps on the upright looms. They could be cotton or wool, they could be dyed or not. And then you finally, in general, there are more weft than warp threads. And that's why sometimes when people are talking about textiles, they talk about a weft count. And when you buy linen, they call it a thread count. And that is, how many threads per inch you find. It's somewhat like the pixelation on a monitor. You'll note if you look at a computer monitor that's at 1900 by 1200 definition as compared to 800 by 600, the higher the number, it means there are more pixels there are. I like to call that like a thread count, and it makes it a better picture. It's the same way in weaving. The higher the weft count, the better the picture is going to look as it's depicted. The better the design is going to look as it's depicted. So as we look at this ancestral Pueblo weaving, it's a twill weave, and it's from about the year 1250 to 1400 AD, found at Montezuma's castle. And you see that it has design patterns that are going to be very similar to what you saw on the ceramics patterns that we saw at Chaco Canyon, as well as among Mogollon and Mimbres ceramics. And you'll also notice that the weave itself is a very thick cloth, and that is because it's more of a twill weave. It's almost like it's doubled up. So there are many different types of weavings that are done too. They're not, and this is more of a sash or a belt. But we'll find out that there were leggings woven of cotton, and then later on wool, as it was introduced by the Spanish. There are mantas, as well as shirts, as well as kilts, sashes, armbands, and the like that were made of woven cotton. And then the types of dyes they would have been using at the time would have been your natural dyes, your vegetal dyes that are plant-based. And so we see a very rich weaving tradition in place among the ancestral Pueblo well before the arrival of the Spanish. And then in the next lesson, we'll see how does this weaving tradition translate across time as well as across cultures when we introduce the Spanish into the Southwest too. And in the next lesson, next week, we'll also be looking at some of the arts of the Hopi, as well as Pueblo ceramics, as well as Navajo textiles and Apache basket weaving, and that's what will move us more forward to contact and to just about reservation period with Art of the Southwest when we close out this 2-lesson sequence of art in the Southwest.